Welcome back. You're watching HFO-TV.
The first question I have is, since we have an economist at the board here as well, most economists that we see or talk to, don't believe that rent control, rent stabilization brings the desired effect due to the lack of construction that comes after the fact. John, I'd like to kind of get your thoughts, and then Tina, how rent stabilization is going to directly affect the new supply that needs to be come in based on the numbers.
Well, okay, as an economist, I'm very skeptical of price controls. And I worry about the impact on supply and maintenance of quality, the uncertainty that gets injected into the process. I think those are absolute keys in thinking about things like price controls.
What I would say about rent stabilization and the supply discussion is rent stabilization policies that are instituted in other places they're not there to make more affordable housing. They're trying to make some predictability and stability in the current market. And there have been a lot of successes in other places, and we will look to other jurisdictions to see what is the best way to handle this. So I'm not an economist, but that's my best understanding of the interaction between the two.
Then how much housing would you expect to decline in terms of stabilization? Is that something that's gone through? Has the state looked at that? Or are you putting this all into the cities to decide if you lift this ban?
Well, and I think, by lifting the preemption, by lifting the ban, we would be putting it back at the local level, which I would anticipate there'd be very robust conversations. I think the city just went through a very thorough public and stakeholder conversation about how to set an inclusionary zoning program, and I have no reason to think they wouldn't do the same. In terms of, has there been analysis? Again, rent stabilization is about the current market, and if people have information to share that says if you don't put it together a certain way, you will have a significant impact on how new housing is built, that would be helpful to hear. One of the feedbacks I've already gotten on the bill, a couple bills that are out there, is that it doesn't specifically exclude new construction. Most rent stabilization policies in other parts do. So let's look at that. We could, exempt new construction. The thing is, you don't want to exempt it in perpetuity because you can probably see why that would be a problem over time. You'd have lots of new being built and none of them being rent stabilized. The goal would be to maybe somehow phase in rent stabilization for new construction after a certain length of time. So I know that that's one piece of feedback we've already gotten, and I think that's something we definitely have to consider and figure out.
Another question that came is, I know you brought this up as well, Tina, is who's going to determine the fair amount of return? I mean, what are we entitled to? Not me, but what is a group entitled to a fair amount of return? You've talked about putting those protections in if we do a rent stabilization.
Well, I would assume we do economic modeling like the same way the city worked on their inclusionary zoning program to look at how it would actually interact with the development market. Well, I know not everyone agreed with that, but I think they tried to look at all sides on it. I think we need to be transparent about what are the costs, what are the ongoing costs. This is why we have public process. I'm not going to say today is like this is how we get decided because we're not at that stage. So,
it's almost like you need a PUC, the Public Utility Commission and regulation of utilities. If you start, because you have to make those kinds of decisions.
And I think that's what you see in other jurisdictions. They have a little bit more of an infrastructure that has those ongoing conversations with the owner and development community to kind of balance that. This is really all about balance and getting the best information possible.
Another question that came up is, since 1980, the Oregon population has grown by 78%. If you look at our permits, as we've talked about, we were not building the amount of units that we did back in, from the 1990 to 2007. We're still way behind. We've got inclusionary zoning in Portland now. We were talking about rent stabilization. How is that addressing the need of supply? Seems to be a disconnection in terms of, we're talking about supply not being the only thing. We're putting in these factors are going to hinder supply. We've already seen that with the amount of permits that got put in the fourth quarter to beat inclusionary zoning. Now we're going to see a slowdown going forward. I guess there's a disconnect from our audience as to the things that are on the table for legislation don't do anything about supply. If anything else, they restrict supply.
Well, again, on the rent stabilization, that's not about supply, that's about managing and helping, add predictability for tenants in the current market for bad actors. So let's be clear about that. On the supply side, we are going to do a weekend at the state, and I know locally with the passage of the local bond, everyone's trying to put some additional public money to help incentivize and help private developers, build more. We definitely need to build more. Can you read the first part of it? So the claim of
The population increasing.
So the population's increasing, and I think you were
Right.
saying about the impact on,
Well, the impact on supply. I mean, you're talking, I know rent stabilization you're saying is not for
Right.
supply, but the unintended consequences, it restricts supply. So, I mean, I understand you're from
well,
a,
and I think that's up for debate. I just want to be, I'm not,
Okay.
I mean, I would,
I mean,
well, what would be helpful for me is if someone could articulate with numbers. So rent stabilization, if you don't guarantee a reasonable rate of return, absolutely. We are not talking about old school rent control where none of that is taken under account. Now, we could argue about, what should that rate of return be? That is why you would have a public process for that. Again, other jurisdictions have done this. When I think about the supply in the Portland market, and maybe John can jump in here, people aren't going to stop moving here. There's going to be a lot of demand. I think there'll be a lot of demand, and therefore I believe there will be a lot of opportunity to have a good business here, make investments, and get reasonable rate of return. If we were living in a community where nobody was moving here and there was no desire to build, then I think we'd be in a different situation. Again, I don't know, John, do you want to weigh in on this at all?
Well, I think that we're going to continue to have this kind of pressure. What I think is interesting is this conversation that you're having here. You can have it in Seattle. You can have it in San Francisco. The places that have done extraordinarily well in their underlying economy, many of them have tight restrictions on land use and that sort of thing that have helped play a role in sending those prices and rents of housing upwards. And it's a tough one.
Well, on that note, just as we, I'm just like waiting for the land use discussion to come up. So in the 2016 session, for those of you who followed it closely, we worked really hard to have a suite of bills that tried to address a variety of things. I supported removing some of the restrictions that have happened in certain communities around the annexation issues, and being able to, local votes were overriding city councils and county decisions to expand and to build on land within an urban growth boundary. We took care of that. We also allowed DLCD to start a pilot to see is there a way to have an expedited process to build affordable housing, to expand urban growth boundaries in other parts of the state. So we could look at some of those things, and I've been willing to look at those things because I think everything has to be on the table. That being said, politically, you're not going to blow up the land use system in the metro area to just, you're not going to see that happen overnight. Again, I look at this as a short-term issue and a long-term issue. And what we probably have to do, and what I would like to do, is set up a process of all these different strategies in a way that they can be assessed as we go forward. I think there's always a concern that if you put something in place and something goes the wrong direction, we can't fix it. On the moratorium bill, I'm not talking about, for the next 10 years. For a year, you could set up rent stabilization policies that get reviewed every couple years. I know that probably as investors and developers, having any unpredictability is a problem. But from my perspective as a policymaker, we have unpredictability for tenants in a way that is really harming a lot of people. So help me find the solution to find some balance back in the market that doesn't have long-term undue effects, but also helps our short-term issue, because we have issues and we have problems.
And the other question is, wouldn't a funding of the current system that's out, that there's a tenant assistance program in Portland, wouldn't better funding of that be a better way to go than putting a rent stabilization policy in place, which again affects supply, affects investment into the area? Just utilizing the policies that are already in place and do better funding in that direction, like a voucher program or something like that. Wouldn't that be a better way to go than doing something industry-wide?
Well, I would like to do more in that arena, but as I've mentioned, unless somebody has a magic money tree somewhere, we're having trouble funding those resources right now. We advocated hard in 2016 to add another $10 million for emergency housing assistance in CHAP, and I know from the county that's pretty much on the almost used up. So we need to continue to do more to help folks. I know there's been some proposals out there to set up a new tax credit to fund those things. Look, we have a program. We need to fund it. We have a budget crisis at the state. We're going to prioritize it to the degree that we can. No one wants more help in that regard than anyone else in the legislature. That's not the only solution. We need all solutions. We need to do everything. The crisis is that large.
Right. I had another question in terms of the ban again in rent stabilization in the state. How much of control how much control is that going to go to the city? I think based on what we've seen lately in the city of Portland, there's not a lot of confidence in how they're doing things. I mean, we heard free rent February last week. So, what can you put down to this from the state to the city?
Well, I think that it depends on how the legislation gets passed. You have some folks who were like, so we believe in local control here in the state of Oregon, and it depends on what the topic is sometimes. But a lot of people just feel like we should just lift the preemption and let cities figure it out. That's it. My bill, 2001, lists the preemption but puts sideboards on it. And things that we think are, reasonable rate of return, making sure we put a few things in there so when Portland goes to pick it up and potentially work on it, we'll have given them some criteria of how they can set up their policy. That will remain to be seen depending on the votes and depending on the input from the public of how we should structure it. It depends. I've seen both. I've seen liftings and inclusionary zoning, we could have just lifted the preemption and then let Portland do whatever. We put some very specific guidelines for cities to implement both the inclusionary zoning and the construction excise tax. And I see Kurt Krieger from the city here. We had lots of conversations about what they didn't like what we were doing, but that's what we ended up doing. So it really is up to you. How do you want to do it? You want to leave it up to Portland? You want to leave it up to us? You want a little bit of a mix? That's the conversation.
The other one was empirical analysis shows that rent control has the following consequences. Developers stop building. Existing landlords will end up converting some of their housing stock to condos or to not non-rent projects. And housing stock deteriorates and landlords have less money and less incentive to invest. Basically, rent stabilization, there was a report done by Portland State, can rent control and rent stabilization solve Portland's housing problem? These are the consequences that came up. What is your response to this report, from a legislative standpoint?
I'd have to look at the report because if we're talking about old school rent control with hard caps, most folks have said that's a bad idea. We have we're talking about new age rent stabilization policies that have, good balance. So I haven't seen that report. I'd have to look at it, but my sense is they're probably talking about old school rent control, which is not what's under consideration. Again, I don't think tenant protections and the discussion we're having about rent stabilization and just cause are the only things we should be doing. I'm going to work across the spectrum. The situation is so deep in our state in terms of the lack of capacity. And maybe we can build more, and I will go and push people and make a whole lot of people uncomfortable. Kurt, I'm coming your way. So that being said, if Measure 97 had passed in November, I'm just giving an example. I would have more capability right now today to prioritize incentives and new dollars for construction, and whatever it would take to put us back in a fire under the development of more units in the state. We have to fund schools, we have to fund healthcare, and we have to fund our public safety system. At this point, the pie is not big enough. If we really want to do this, we have to push ourselves to figure out how we can. So I agree with that. So.
Again, thank you for coming. Thank you, Tina. Thank you, John.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Our entire office specializes in multifamily real estate, making HFO the largest multifamily brokerage in the Pacific Northwest. Your success is our passion. Build your legacy with HFO. Call 503-241-5541 or visit our website at hfore.com for more information.